Good evening, class. Those of you who are sitting in front of me, those of you at home, those of you who are in different places actually in the world, and by the way, different time zones. For some people, I know for our friends in the Philippines, this is morning. They're watching it this time in the morning. Some of the people in Europe are probably taping it. They're going to watch it tomorrow morning. But we welcome you into the class. Don't forget, if you have questions, if you have comments, you can call the number that is on the website, and you can give us your questions, your comments, and even a prayer request, and we'd be glad to pray with you. Tonight, we are starting on the tribe of Dan. And the tribe of Dan and the tribe of Judah, what you'll find, they were very close, and even in their migrations, they seem to end up close to each other wherever they travel. And so that becomes very important to us. You will look and you will see on your chart that the mother of Dan, was Bilhah. So the mother of Dan was Bilhah, B-I-L-H-A-H. We read about that in Genesis 36. And we will see that Bilhah was Rachel's handmaid. Because we know that Leah, her sister Leah, had given birth to Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah, and she cried out to the Lord, and then finally she gave her handmaid to Jacob, Israel, and she bore Dan. So Bilhah was the maidservant of Rachel, who would become mother of Joseph and Benjamin. And Bilhah also bore Naphtali, and that will also become important as they begin to travel. Because in their travels, Dan and Naphtali are often linked together with one another. So not only were they linked together because they had the same mother, but they were linked together once they were carried off into captivity, and then in their migrations they seemed to end up close to each other. So when the tribe of Dan came out of Egypt with the rest of the children of Israel, they were the second most populous of the tribes. So they were the second largest. And they were second only to Judah when they left Egypt. So the Bible tells us, and we can see this in Numbers, so that we'll check it out to make sure that I'm telling you the truth. They had 62,700 men between the ages of 20 and 60. And the reason why they counted the men between the ages of 20 and 60 was for what purpose? They were the fighting men. They were the ones who were able to fight and defend. And so Numbers, and the book of Numbers is just that. It talks about all the numbers that are important. So if you will look at Numbers chapter 2, because they're beginning to count. So in 2:26, the standard of the forces with Dan shall be on the north side according to their armies, and the leader of the children of Dan shall be Ahiezer, the son of Ammishaddai. And his army was numbered at 62,700. Okay? Now, in addition to those fighting men, you also had what? You had women, children, and the elderly. So the son of Dan was called Hushim. And you will read that in Genesis 46:23. He gave rise to the Danite clan known as the Shuhami. You read about that now all the way back on Numbers 26, 43. All the families of the Shuhamites, according to those who were numbered of them, were 64,400. So you had the Hushim, and they became the clan of Shuhami. Now, according to the tribe of Dan, okay, according to legend, and I would say some historical records, you know, remember we were talking about when you deal with the history of Ireland, Scotland, and part of Great Britain, we said that there's history, myth, and legend all kind of get together, and you have a hard time trying to sort it out. Well, there is a legend, but also there is some historical record there that says the tribe of Dan left the land of Israel after the 10 tribes separated themselves from Judah, okay? Now, in other words, rather than engage in a struggle with their brothers, they went into voluntary exile. Okay? Because, as I said, there was some kind of tie there, and you will find Dan and Judah sometimes are going to be together. And so rather than engage in a struggle, they just went into voluntary exile. Now the book of Judges, chapter 18, Judges 18. They talk about 600 men. So Judges 18 says that 600 men from Dan in the south went north, and they found a place named Laish, L-A-I-S-H, L-A-I-S-H. And they found there inhabitants who lived like Sidonian Phoenicians. You say, well, what is their key to that? Well, the Phoenicians were sailors. They were people of the sea. They knew how to build boats and ships, and they knew how to, basically, they were not going to be landlocked. They were going to take to the sea. Now, this becomes very important because the Danites went into this area, learned everything that they could from the Sidonian Phoenicians, conquered Laish, and wiped out the inhabitants. You know, it's like, we're going to learn everything we can from you. And by the way, we're not saying that was good. We're not even saying that God approved of that. It's just what happened. So they renamed the place. Guess what? They renamed the place Dan. Now remember we said one of the ways you can trace the tribes is wherever they went, they stamped their name on it. How many have ever heard of the Danube River?
Oh yeah.
That's from the tribe of Dan. Dan had done the same thing in Leshem. So let's look at Joshua 19:47. They just love to put their names on things, but that's a good thing because now we know where they went. So in Joshua 19:47, and the border of the children of Dan went beyond these, because the children of Dan went up to fight against Leshem and took it, and they struck it with the edge of the sword, took possession of it, and dwelt in it. They called Leshem Dan, after the name of their father. So they said, we're going to call this place Dan. Okay? So the place called Leshem and renamed Dan in the book of Joshua was a site that some of you all are quite familiar with because you did a great deal of walking there just a few months ago. Remember?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the site called Dan in northern Galilee. And it is a kind of a neat place. Some of you, I don't know if any of you were with me when we actually did the hiking at Dan. Brother Terry, you were, when we actually, the Jordan River was flowing, and we were actually going from stone to stone. Yeah, you were too. The river was there, and you went from stone to stone. Yeah, you were too, and it was somewhat slippery, but we take care of one another, do we not, Brother Terry? We never lost anyone in the Jordan River. We all got from stepping stone to stepping stone. But what is so beautiful, I will tell you, there is probably, it's one of the most beautiful places in all of Israel to go back in there. There are fig leaves that are like this big. And then you understand about sewing fig leaves together. They're not like the little fig leaves on your little tree that you might have here. They're huge, but it's just beautiful. And to see that flowing river, and we saw the flowing river this time, we just weren't in it going in the hike. But beautiful. And Laish, also renamed Dan, was in the kingdom of Shema of Cilicia. And Cilicia is what is today known as modern-day southeast Turkey. So you can see Dan got around. Okay. Now, Turkey. It was southeast Turkey. So near Laish, and by the way, if you're looking online or you're going to be looking, doing some research on your own, it can also appear as Luash, Luash. So it's the same place. And it is basically called Luash of the Dananu. Okay, that's tribe of Dan. So, I mean, they love stamping their name everywhere they went. And so there was an entity of Yaudi, which was a grouping of Judeans. Okay, so now you know that they are of the tribe of Judah, and they were adjoining the Dananu of Small, what is now Turkey. And usually, Yadi and Shmal were usually ruled by the same king. So they had one king over both groups. Okay. Now I want us to go to Genesis 49:16. Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. And Dan shall be a serpent, by the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider shall fall backward. Now, this phrase about Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path, this phrase in Hebrew could mean that the tribe of Dan, and that should be wood, W-O-L-D, not W-O-8, or not. And I have no excuse for that, and my finger hit the wrong key. And that means that the tribe of Dan would leave the name of their tribe everywhere along the path they went in their migrations following captivity by the Assyrians. Because if you have ever, particularly been in the desert, and there are times when we have been in the desert, actually some of us have been in the Sinai, some of us have certainly been in the Negev. And you can tell, sometimes you get there when a viper has just been there. I like it when it's gone, when I get there, okay? But you can see it. And you can see the trail. Why? Because it leaves a path in that soft dust of the sand of the wilderness. So examples of this are in Judges 18:12. So let's go to Judges 18:12 so you and I are telling you the truth. says, they were speaking of them, it says the Danites went from there. And they went up in Judges 18:12, and they encamped in Kirjath Jearim in Judah. Again, you kind of see what? You see a coming together of Judah and Dan. You will see this often. Therefore, they called that place Mahanadan to this day. And it's west of Kirjath Jearim. Actually, Jearim, that is what? Of Judah. So Mahanadan means camp of Dan. So here they are again. They go and they say, we're going to call this place Mahanadan. So Dan. And then, of course, we know they named Lashem, renamed after Dan, their father, Joshua 19:41, which we looked at. And then Laish, renamed after their father Dan in Judges 18:29. And they called the name of the city Dan after the name of Dan, their father, who was born to Israel, meaning born to Jacob. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. They didn't let anything keep the same name. They stamped Dan everywhere they went. The king of Smaal in Turkey called himself King of the Danim, D-A-N-I-M. And of course, that is Hebrew for King of the Dans. So the neat thing about all the breadcrumbs they've left us in stamping the name of their tribe wherever they migrated is, they also loved rivers, because remember, they're influenced by the Phoenicians. They just loved the sailing. They just grabbed onto that. And so they just loved rivers, and they loved getting out basically in the Mediterranean Sea. And so wherever they went, they named rivers after their ancestor. The Don River, which in Hebrew is the same as Dan, because what? Hebrew is a consonant language. Hebrew has no vowels. How many know you can't pronounce something without a vowel? No. So the Masoretes in the 4th century then added the vowel points. And some of you took Hebrew with me, and you know all the fun of trying to memorize the vowel points, right? So, but it's the same. Daled, Nun, whether it's any other vowel. You just have a vowel point. Sometimes it's a dot, sometimes it's a little thing like this, remember? So it's Don, Danister River, they named that. The Danaper, and of course the Danube, the one we are most familiar with. And guess what? The name Denmark is, in Danish, is Danmark. So in Danish, and actually Denmark could just as well be what? Danmark. Mark of Dan. And that means border or region of Dan. So boy, when they got there, they said, this is our place. We're going to name it. Now the prophetess Deborah describes Dan as a sea-going entity. And kind of a rather interesting thing that Deborah says about this tribe. And we'll put it in context. In Judges, chapter 6, 7. That is, okay. So, I think I may have, that's not it, but I can tell you the scripture, so that is the wrong, I will tell you what it is. I know by heart what the passage is. I know that is not the right address for it in the word. But it's where there was a battle. There was a battle. And Deborah is trying to get all of the tribes to come together to do battle to push the enemy out. And Deborah, the prophetess, was complaining about Dan and says, why, where's Dan? Why is Dan still in his ships?
Yeah.
Why has he not come to help us? Okay. And I might.
It's 5:17.
Thank you, it's 5:17.
Judges.
Okay.
Yeah, 5:17.
Judges 5:17. So now I'll be able to read that to you. Gilead, so she's upset. This is all the prophetess Deborah speaking. And she's saying, I'm going to pick up at 16 so you'll get the gist of this. She says, why did you sit among the sheepfolds? Remember Reuben, when we were saying the tribe of Reuben? It was around the sheepfolds because that was their wealth, and they had sheep and they had cattle, and that's why today there's a tribe of Judah who primarily are in France. They are known for their cheese because they had their flocks and they had their herds, and they stayed among the sheepfolds to hear the piping for the flocks. The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, so they didn't come. All those we know, remember, half tribe of Manasseh, they're over there, and they didn't even bother to cross the river to help. And then here's this. And why did Dan remain on ships? I mean, all they had to do was just turn those sails and come back and help us, and they didn't. So she was complaining about that. So, by the way, this was a Phoenician characteristic. So one finds Israelites from Dan in Tyre. In Tyre, T-Y-R-E. T-Y-R-E. Anyone ever hear anything about Tyre? New Testament, okay? Okay, remember Lydia. Okay, she comes from Tyre, and she had what? She was very wealthy businessman, a woman. No, no, we are not into that. Very wealthy bit. We're going to call her a woman. So if you want to call me or write to me, oh, business person, don't, because I will read it and then it will go to file 13. So don't call and say business woman. And remember, she was very wealthy. And the reason is because the mollusks from which they get that purple, they did what? They got them from the sea, because they were seafaring people. So you see Dan in Tyre, the Phoenician city. And you'll see that in 1 Kings 7:13, and that is the right reference. Now the prophet Ezekiel linked Dan together with Javan, and Javan is the ancestor of the Greeks, Greece, Crete, that area. Again, many seafarers. If you remember the movie Exodus, remember they were on Cyprus, and you had Cyprus, and the man was a Greek, and he got him that ship. It was barely seaworthy, but he got it for them, and again, the reason being they have always been associated, and the early ancestors of those Greek isles were very much involved in sailing. So he links Dan together with Javan as trading with Phoenician Tyre. Yes, trading, T-R-A-D-I-N-G. So they were doing trading, and you can see this in 1 Kings. And you can see it in Ezekiel 27. So if you look just before Daniel, Ezekiel 27:19. So in 27:19, Dan and Javan. So there, now you see the interconnection between Dan and Javan. Paid for your wares, traversing back and forth, wrought iron, cassia, and cane were among your merchandise. So in order to get merchandise as varied as this, they were really venturing out in their sailing. Greek tradition says that Danaus, after coming out of Egypt with his 2 daughters to Greece, okay, so this is Greek tradition. I said tradition sometimes has history to it, might have some myth to it, but there is a grain of truth in all the tradition. So, and his brothers went to, that's supposed to be Jerusalem. I have no idea what happened with that. And as you'll notice, I really don't, because there's not even enough space for that T there, so. Computers, technology is wonderful when it works. Okay? So that's supposed to be Jerusalem. So in Greece, the daughters of Danaus intermarried with the local aristocracy, and their children became rulers, which kind of sounds like what? You will, wherever you go, you will always be the head and not the tail. So in honor of Danaus, the local Pelasgian, Ionian Greeks renamed themselves Danaioi. Because why? Because their ancestry has now, through the intermarriage, they're the tribe of Dan. How many know that God knows where every one of these descendants are today? They may not even know who they are, but God knows who they are. Now Homer, and Homer was a real poet, remember? He refers to the early Greeks by this name. How about that? So when Homer is talking about early Greeks of this period, he calls them Danaioi. Now in Irish accounts, the Dana were said to have previously fought the Philistines in Greece. Now do you see why I say some of the history, some of the tradition, there's a grain of truth there. You're like, okay, all right, okay, that makes sense. Now, I'm going to ask you this. Who knows a very famous member of the tribe of Dan who fought Philistines?
Solomon. No, Samson.
Samson. Samson.
Samson.
And when you understand the path of migration traveled by the tribe of Dan, then you go, remember that we looked at the Pillars of Hercules. But actually, that was a name change. They were remembering their ancestor, but they're so far out from the event, they just morphed him into the mythological person of Hercules. They said, well, that was our ancestor. Yeah. We'll just call him Hercules because they won't understand our ancestor, so we'll just say, oh, that's your Hercules.
And they were right.
Okay. Now, in Irish accounts, the Dana were said to have previously fought the Philistines in Greece before coming to Ireland. Now, archaeologists now believe, now this was very important, that an offshoot of the Hyksos kings, shepherd kings from Egypt. I need to stop here. Remember when Joseph rose to prominence and the whole thing, he was reunited with his brothers, and then he says, go bring my father, and all of the brothers, the father, the brothers, their families, moved to Egypt. And actually, Joseph was second only to Pharaoh. The only person who was higher than Joseph was the Pharaoh himself. And so they came in, they were given all of the most fertile areas. Why? Because they were herdsmen, they had flocks and cattle, and so they were given this real fertile land. And they were made kings. Kings. And they were called the Hyksos kings. And they called them Hyksos because they were shepherd kings in Egypt. And of course, that went on for a long time until there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, didn't remember Joseph. And that's when the persecution began to happen toward the children of Israel. But archaeologists believe that an offshoot of the Hyksos kings, about the time when they were expelled from Egypt, okay, so they thought, well, okay, we need to get out of here before the persecution. They came to Greece, conquered Greece, and laid the basis for the Mycenaean civilization of Greece. The reason is because archaeologists have looked at certain finds in Egypt during the period of the Hyksos. And guess what? They find some of the same things later period in Greece. So they identify then these Hyksos with the Danaioi of Greek tradition. Why? Because they have found the same type of artwork. They see the same type of patterns, whether it's burial patterns, whether it's culture, whether it's things they made. Because I would ask you, if you find identical things in Greece to what you find when you're doing archaeological digs in Egypt, and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, different period, and now they're almost identical. They have found certain language, cultural language patterns, earlier period of the Hyksos in Egypt, and then later period in Greece. Somebody traveled somewhere and left patterns for us, okay? So while the Danaioi were relatively few in numbers, they were considered to be of very high quality. Now think about it. Here they are. Here come the Danaioi, and all of a sudden, they're considered to be very high quality people. Well, the Hyksos had been foreign rulers of Egypt who came from Canaan. They were shepherd kings. They came from Canaan. So in Egyptian tradition, the Hyksos were expelled. Think about this. Just coincidence, right? Egyptian history. Okay? And Egyptian tradition says the Hyksos were expelled about the time when Scripture says the Exodus took place. Now, what one person sees is, we expelled them. We threw them out. Someone else sees it as, God delivered us. But here's what comes together. Two different views, but what comes together? The time and the leaving. Now, wouldn't the Egyptian tradition and history say, we expelled these people, we kicked them out? But we know what? God delivered them and they left. Okay? So a great many of the Hyksos were Israelites. Now, Irish tradition, and we looked at that, remember we were looking at Milo and that whole tradition there last week. Irish tradition identifies the later Milesian, that should be conquerors too. I was talking with someone today, he said, well, nobody's perfect, and I'm thinking, oh, I know that very well. So they were the later Milesian conquerors of Ireland. And remember, the Milesians traced their ancestry back to the tribe of Judah, part of the tribe of Judah. And they trace with a group that had been present in Egypt during the Hyksos period. And who were associated with none other than the Hebrews. Hebrews, Hebrews. This will help you remember this one. Between a married couple, who should make the coffee? The man. Hebrews. You'll never forget Hebrews. So wives, just point to your husbands. I read it in the Bible, Hebrews. Now, part of the tribe of Dan may have been exiled in 1000 BC. Now, we know that that's prior to the destruction of Samaria, Samaria, in 722 BC. So we got part. Now we know, yeah, Dan was a part. There was a part of Dan, went all the way up into the northern part. And basically, that part of Dan went as far north as they could and still be within the territory of Israel. There's a spiritual lesson there. Going as far, as far as I can go. I'll still be called by that name, but I want to go as far away as I can. And those of us who've been there know that it is as far as you can go and still be within the borders. But there were others who left, just like the Zara line of Judah. Remember the Zara line of Judah? The twin sons Zara and Pharez. Zara left Egypt when they were allowed to come and go and trade, and they just left before there was ever bondage or an exodus. So there was, in the same way, there was a part of Dan that also left prior to the destruction of Samaria in 722 BC. This is an interesting fact. The tribe of Dan, according to the Bible, specialized in metallurgy, working in metals. Aholiab and Horam were expert artisans and metal workers. So I would ask you a question. If in the wilderness, when they were exiled and they had the Exodus and they were going around the desert, they were metal workers. Would you expect that wherever they would go, then they would do some of the same things, right? That's okay. Guess what? Archaeological findings reveal the existence of a metal industry in Dan of the Galilee that dates to the time of the Israelite conquest. So guess what? They're coming in. Remember, they said, well, we want, I know this is you've given us this portion, but we would also like a portion in the north. So here they go, they move in. What do we find there? Archaeologists find evidence of a metal industry, and it dates to the time when they entered the Promised Land. And this industry specialized first in bronze and afterward in iron. And you can visit Tel Dan today, and some of you did recently, and did you not see some of the evidence of the metalwork there? Yeah, that was a few months ago. Oh. So the Sea Peoples, with whom the Danao were associated, were sophisticated, guess what? Copper smelters. Copper, C-O-P-P-E-R, copper. So Dan in the Galilee was destroyed in the 800s BC. Now, knowing that Samaria fell in 722 BC, why do you think Dan was destroyed earlier than that? Okay, and you give you a hint. Location, location, location. They were on the farthest northern border toward the area, closer to the area of Assyria than anyone else. Because they said, we want to go as far as we can and still be within the borders. And guess what? When the Assyrians came down, who would have fallen first? They would have, Dan. So Dan in the Galilee was destroyed in the 800s, and that should have been the Syrian king. The Syrian king, Ben-Hadad, attacked Dan of Galilee in 815 BC. And after that, it was unheard of. And it was. We don't hear anything about them at all. So you know that they, after they were attacked very early on, probably obviously taken captive first group that would have been taken captive, and then eventually they would have begun to do what? They would have begun to migrate and begin to migrate north and westward, and that's where they stamped their name as they began this whole process. Now the Egyptians counted the Danites among the peoples of the sea. They connected the Dananu primarily with areas on the North Syrian coast. So they said they were there. The Egyptians said that's where they were. With Cilicia, Turkey, and this is what I shared with you earlier, and with Cyprus, 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 and possibly Crete, because they're all in there together. The Bible says that the Philistines came from Caphtor, which is believed to be another name for Cyprus. So when you understand, remember what the Greek history says? Oh, that they fought the Philistines in Greece. Well, kind of makes sense if the Philistines came from Caphtor, which is believed to be another name for Cyprus, and when you understand Greece and Cyprus, okay, that begins to make some sense now. The Danites conquered Cyprus and the Assyrians. Now remember, the Assyrians are the ones that came down, captured Dan, took them captive in Assyria, and eventually they began allowed to migrate. And so they're going out, and guess what? The Assyrians referred to the island of Cyprus as Yadnana, meaning Isle of the Dananu. Dananu, D-A-N-U-N-U. So does it matter to us that here are the Assyrians who captured the tribe of Dan and kind of would know where they began to migrate out of Assyria? And they called the island of Cyprus, there had to be a reason why the Assyrians called it that. And in Assyrian records, which we have, they called the island of Cyprus Yadnana, meaning Isle of the Dananu. So obviously, somebody from Dan had to end up there. The Assyrians said, well, that's what that is. That's the Isle of the Dananu. Now, Irish legends spoke of the tribe of Dana, remember? And they called them what? Tuatha Danann. The what? The tribe of Dan. Basically, that is in Gaelic and Irish language. Tuatha Danann. And guess what? The Tuatha De Danann, guess what? They just happened, right? Just happened to pop up, and they were renowned metallurgists. It is recorded that they arrived from the Northern Isles after some disaster. The only Northern Isles as far as Ireland is concerned. And that's why I'm giving you the map so you can see this and say, well, boy, they've gone far north. So the only northern isles as far as Ireland is concerned are those of Scandinavia. Scandinavia. Once again, Dan stamps the name. Because remember, in Hebrew, D-I-N would be the same as D-A-N or D-E-N, D-N, Scandinavia. And Irish sources said that the tribe of Dan had originally come from Lebanon, which again is in that what area? In the area of tribal allotments. And they had sojourned, guess where they sojourned? I'm not saying this, I'm saying Irish sources say that they had sojourned in, of all places, Greece. So, how many are seeing a pattern here? You're seeing an archaeological pattern, you're seeing a language pattern, you're seeing a name pattern, you're seeing the metallurgy keeps popping up, the professions keeps popping up, and you're seeing Irish sources saying the same thing, Greek sources are saying. So remember, the Northern Isles are Scandinavia, again named after the tribe of Dan, and Irish sources said they came from Lebanon and they sojourned in Greece, which is what, remember, other people said, oh yeah, they fought the Philistines, the tribe of Dan fought the Philistines in Greece. So you're beginning to see similarities, constant repetition. Okay? So and now we have Irish sources saying, now this is not Greek sources, these now are Irish sources saying they fought the Philistines. Remember I said they came from a disaster? Well, they fought the Philistines and then fled north, after which they come to Ireland. So we're seeing Greek history, Irish history begin to dovetail in the same events. Now we look at Welsh legends. And they called them the children of Dawn. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's Dawn or Dan, same word in Hebrew, Daled Nun. And they spoke of the children of Dawn who paralleled the tribe of Dana. And I said in Hebrew pronunciations of Dan and Dawn are interchangeable. Dan came to the north in, oh wow, that's supposed to be in two major waves. Really, I promise I was not drinking unless it was, I don't know, tea maybe. Maybe somebody put something in the tea.
Still too much caffeine.
Yeah, maybe it was caffeinated tea. To north in two major waves, not intwo. Two major waves. Shortly after the exile of the 10 tribes from the northern kingdom of Israel, okay, Danites entered Scandinavia, and from there they moved to the British Isles. Okay, so now what we see, they enter Scandinavia, okay, and they've been in Ireland, and now they're ending up in the British Isles. Now, much later, and that's where you need your Scythia map. Remember your map that has Scythia on it? Remember Scythia between the Black and the Caspian Seas? Because now we have another group of Dan. And this is much later, they emerged from Scythia, Scythia. You should have your maps of Scythia. And they guess where they ended up? Just happened to end up right in Scandinavia. And guess what? They also moved westward to the British Isles. Now, let me ask you a question. Remember what God said? He said, I will scatter you among the nations. And in their migrations, how many have ever grew up hearing this? Birds of a feather flock together. Do you understand what's happening? These people are people that probably in the first and second generations after the exile by Assyria began to lose. Some of them lost their language, some of them lost their identity, but there was some little thing they held on to. But even as they migrate, guess what? They may not even know that these are their brethren, but they're birds of a, there's something that draws these people together and end up in some of the same places, and they end up doing some of the same jobs, and they end up doing things the same way, because this is God's plan. He said, I will scatter you. Assyria may have thought they did it. Babylon may have thought they did some things, but guess what? God said, I will scatter you into the nations. But he had made a promise to Abraham that in that happening, they would what? Be a blessing to all nations. He's still working his plan. Now, the Damni of Scythia, remember? And which is where they first went. Remember when they first were exiled, they put them in that buffer zone between the Black and Caspian Seas to basically be the first line of defense for any enemies coming against Assyria. So guess what? The Damni of Scythia were called the Damoni of Scotland. Scotland called them Damoni. But they still get that name in there. The British Damnonis of Damnonia was the name given to Devon. Devon. So what you see here is, again, you see similar letters, right? And Cornwall in southwest England bordering Wales.
Bordering what?
Wales.
Wales.
W-A-L-E-S. So guess what? Damnonia was named after the tribe of what? Dan. Now again, these people are migrating, they're being pushed from all different, sometimes it's people pushing them, sometimes they're just going to conquer more lands. And you will see that even though they have lost their identity, they're even going to end up with tribes that they associated with when they first entered the Holy Land, the Promised Land. So in Scotland, the Damnoni of Dan joined the Gadini of, guess what tribe? Gad. Gad.
Yeah, the Jugamuni.
So when one traces the tribes, one comes across instances of different groups from the same tribe being drawn to a specific region at different times. So, same tribe, we looked at the tribe of Dan, remember, different times, and they pop up close to each other at different times. They took a different migration route, but they were doing the same things. They had the same occupations. They had some of the same cultural habits that archaeologists have discovered, but they end up in the same region at different times. So we have the Danes, and this will be the last thing we'll have to stop after note 17. The Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes gave rise to the Vikings. So Danes from Dan are recorded as having been with the tribe of Naphtali and Scythia. They were together. From Scythia, the Danes probably moved through Sweden and conquered Denmark, and they probably called it Denmark. Because everywhere they... Oh, my battery just went dead, so I'm going to have to really project. the Danes and the Norwegians made up most of the Vikings who invaded England. So the Danes settled in the northeast of England. And where do you think the Norwegian Vikings settled? They settled in the northwest of England. And then this same group of people settled in Ireland and in parts of Scotland. And next week we will look at the flag of Wales. It's kind of interesting because the flag of Wales contains what? Guess what? It just accidentally has one of the symbols for the tribe of Dan.
Snake.
Now remember what I said? Right. Because what happens is they may have forgotten who they are. They may have forgotten their tribal identities. And how many know some things get passed down from families? Families pass, oh, we used to do this, we used to do that. And families hold on to certain traditions. Well, somehow this symbol carried them through, and they might have forgotten who it was about. There's something special about this symbol. Remember the tribe of Judah and the red hand? Do you understand that Northern Ireland, think about this, the Northern Ireland has a Star of David on their flag. Where do you think that came from? From the tribe of Judah. And when they stamped that red hand, all they knew is that was symbolic because our ancestor was born first. And then they thought, we are the rightful heirs. We are the rightful firstborn that should be the ruler and have the scepter. We're Judah. And so what did they do? They took that Star of David and they took it wherever they went. They probably, and I guarantee you there are people in Northern Ireland that don't even know the significance of the fact that they got a Star of David on their flag. Well, we all know. I'm sorry, they're like some of our younger generation that don't understand our own history and the significance of it. How many, and really, how, we've got a symbol. And it says, don't tread on me. There's a reason for that. And it, by the way, it goes back to the majority tribes here in the United States, which we haven't got to yet, but we will next. So, pulling all the pieces together, I hope it's a little clearer now. The one thing I want you to see is God had a plan. He worked his plan, and the tribes are not lost. He knows where every one of them is. If you're watching tonight, if you have questions, I would love to hear your questions. And like I said, if you have a question, probably 10 other people have the same question, ask it and I will answer it. I get all the questions that come in through the mail. If you call it in and leave a message, I get that. And I will answer your questions, and I will answer your questions in class so that if somebody else had the same question, they would get it. Don't forget to send me your prayer request. Let me know that you were watching tonight. And we will pick up next week on the symbols for the tribe of Dan. Have a wonderful rest of the night, and I hope that your brain isn't kind of scrambled with all the stuff I threw at you tonight. It will all come together as we trace all of the tribes, where they have been and where they are now, and we all know where they one day will be, receiving their tribal allotments. Have a great night.